guys know I love the Sega Saturn. It came at a time of great stress in my life. I was a 19-year-old kid recovering from some really bad decisions that derailed everything for me. And with the help of my family, friends, and gaming, I got my life back on track. I loved so many of the Saturn's unique games. I mean, you couldn't play stuff like Knights, Burning Rangers, Dragon Force, or Guardian Heroes on any other console. Hell, some of its games you still can't. It was the perfect complement to my love of the arcade scene as well, with a number of ports that looked and played spectacular. While we all lament its performance in the West, there has been a growing and overwhelming trend to candy coat the Saturn's performance in Japan. It's even to the point where the Saturn is considered by many to be a success in Japan, and the Nintendo 64 a dismal failure, despite the two platforms selling very close numbers. To be clear, I'm not excusing myself from this statement, as I have said many times in my videos that the Saturn's fortunes in Japan were much better and have used that to sell the idea that the Saturn was special. The truth of that isn't quite so simple, however, and in this episode, we will be looking at just how the Saturn performed in its native country and whether or not all those claims about how much better things were are actually true. I hope you guys enjoy the Sega Saturn in Japan. Before we get into the Saturn's life, it's really important to understand where Japan was before the system was ever available. Unlike in the rest of the world, the 16-bit era had been thoroughly dominated by Nintendo and its Super Famicom in Japan, or what we knew as the Super Nintendo. The Japanese Mega Drive, or Genesis to us here in North America, was absolutely slaughtered in terms of both hardware and software sales. Even the PC Engine, the Japanese version of the TurboGrafx-16, outsold Sega's 16-bit efforts quite easily. The arcade scene was of course radically different at this point. Things have been working up to an explosion of 3D polygon-based games for years at this point, with the likes of Namco and Sega locked in a technology war that had given us some great games already. And this ultimately became the real draw of the 5th generation of consoles in Japan. They promised to bring home titles like Virtua Fighter, Daytona USA, and Ridge Racer, or to look at it on a grander scale, 3D polygon games that could never have been done by the Super Famicom and Mega Drive. The 3DO had already been released in early 1994 in Japan and had some success with its library of arcade ports and multimedia-inspired capabilities. The Japanese market was primed and ready for these machines and their promise of a new era of gaming. When the Saturn launched in Japan on November 22, 1994, it was destined for immediate success. Virtua Fighter had been a massive hit there in the arcade, and the home version was one of the most anticipated releases of the year. To be blunt, the sheer popularity of this title alone pretty much guaranteed that the Saturn was going to move an impressive amount of hardware units. The hype was real, and it was driving interest in Sega's new machine at an incredible pace. But you have to understand that the stars were aligning here for Sega on an unprecedented level, for also in November of 1994, Virtua Fighter 2 had been released in Japanese arcades. This was a 1-2 punch for Sega, with pretty much the entire campaign being built on the premise that you could play the first Virtua Fighter at home now, Virtua Fighter 2 in the arcade, and eventually its home port in the near future. I cannot stress enough how much the entire Saturn experience was based on this thinking. In fact, there were only 5 games released in Japan at the Japanese launch, and Sega had rested the entire fortune of their success on the Virtua Fighter franchise alone. Daytona USA wasn't ready, Panzer Dragoon wasn't ready, even the secondary lineup like Astral and Clockwork Knight weren't ready for the launch. But it didn't matter. Virtua Fighter was the anchor, and Sega was betting heavily on its appeal to own it at home. So influential was this game in Japan, it actually inspired the man behind the Sony PlayStation, Ken Kutaragi, to make that system entirely polygon-focused because he saw the future of the industry in those simple flat-shaded visuals. That's right, my retro-loving friends. Had it not been for this game, the PlayStation likely would have ended up a very different machine. Sega's bet on Virtua Fighter paid off big time. The Saturn's first day on the market, it moved 170,000 units of hardware, with Virtua Fighter selling at a 1-to-1 attach rate. That means that every single Saturn sold there, a copy of Virtua Fighter sold with it. A 100% attach rate. By the end of December that year, Sega had sold 500,000 Saturns, and was firmly ahead of the PlayStation by nearly a 2-to-1 margin.
2, ready, go!
With its first year under its belt, the Saturn was doing strongly in Japan in both hardware and software numbers. A release of Virtua Fighter Remix had kept interest up for the platform, as did a number of high-profile releases like Panzer Dragoon, and it was already receiving strategy, puzzle, and RPG games to fill in the blanks around its arcade-focused lineup. To celebrate its 1 millionth Saturn sold, Sega lowered the price of the hardware a bit and packed in Virtua Fighter Remix, increasing its appeal even more. It was continuing to outsell the PlayStation handily at this point in Japan, and a new wave of excitement and hype kicked up with the coming trio of Virtua Cop, Sega Rally, and of course, Sega's ace in the hole, Virtua Fighter 2. The anticipation of this drove Saturn sales again to new heights, and by the time 1996 began, Sega had over 2 million Saturns in Japanese homes. Virtua Fighter 2 became the platform's best-selling game, moving 1.7 million units of software in Japan alone. To sum this up as simply as I can, the first and second entries in the Virtua Fighter series had almost single-handedly been responsible for millions of Saturns sold in Japan. For the very first time there, Sega's arcade-related software had equaled success for its home console, and things were looking quite bright for Saturn's future.
1, ready, go! KO.
In early 1996, Sega redesigned the Saturn and released it as the white round button variant we all know so well today. This also came with a massive drop in price of the unit, now retailing for less than half its original launch asking price. Combined with high-profile successes like Shin Megami Tensei Devil Summoner, Sakura Wars, and Langrisser 3, the Saturn's momentum was going strong throughout the year. In fact, just in 1996 alone, the Saturn received more software in Japan than the platform got in its entire life in the rest of the world. Sega had built the Saturn for its own games, but third-party support had been strong in Japan as well. It was receiving a varied lineup of arcade-based 2D and 3D games, as well as a pile of exclusive home-based content that was keeping customers happy. The vast majority of these games would not come to the US and Europe, forcing Saturn fans from other regions to heavily import titles, which of course only served as a further boon for the Japanese market. As 1996 came to a close, Sega and its Saturn continued to be Japan's top-selling hardware with an additional 2 million systems sold. It had not fallen victim to the negative press about its capabilities like it did in North America, and the popularity of the Virtua Fighter series had given it enough boost to counter much of the software Sony's PlayStation had seen. The Saturn had even weathered the Japanese launch of the Nintendo 64, which landed with something of a thud. Despite the availability of Mario 64, the popularity of the Saturn easily overshadowed it. 1996 had also afforded Sega as much as 1 million systems sold lead over Sony, but things were about to change in a big way. While Sega had been enjoying its successes in Japan and riding the wave of Virtua Fighter fever, Sony had been cultivating third-party support since 1994, and it was about to pay off and turn the tide completely. If there was one game the Japanese wanted more than Virtua Fighter, it was Final Fantasy, and Part 7 launched there in January of 1997 exclusively for Sony's machine. The impact of this single release cannot be denied on the Japanese market. It sold over 2 million units in just the first few days it was available, and the Japanese gaming press doled out praise for it universally. This massive boost to the popularity of the PlayStation in Japan erased Sega's lead virtually overnight. Sony's first and third-party releases began to pay further dividends as 1997 moved on, with releases like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Final Fantasy Tactics, Breath of Fire 3, and Gran Turismo all tearing up the Japanese charts. To add to Sega's woes, the failure of the Saturn in North America and Europe had produced widespread panic and disillusionment within the company. Most of the Western management left by mid-year, and the new guys coming in made it clear Sega was looking to replace the Saturn as soon as possible. Magazine articles began to show up about Sega working on new hardware, and the writing was on the wall. Sega had gone from having the lead platform in Japan to a company about to abandon it, and as 1997 closed, Sony had caught and passed them in hardware units sold. Sega's management was in disarray, and the world now knew that the Saturn was not Sega's future. I want to stop here in 1997 to bring up something I hear far too often. That would be how the Saturn's performance in Japan was influenced by Sagata Sanshiro, our rough and tumble Sega spokesman who whipped ass if you weren't playing your Saturn. Time and time again I hear about how those ads were directly responsible for the Saturn's image in Japan and how it helped Sega sell the hardware so well. This couldn't be further from the truth, unfortunately. Sagata actually didn't show up in Saturn commercials and print ads until the second half of 1997, well into the system's life. In fact, looking at the numbers, the vast majority of the Saturns had already been sold in Japan before Sagata ever showed up, and by the time the campaign really got going in 1998, the Saturn was mere months away from being replaced by Sega's new Dreamcast. Make no mistake, Sagata is one of the coolest ad campaigns ever, but he was late in the Saturn's life and contributed absolutely nothing to its success aside from some really cool memories.
あとはドリームキャストの発売を待つばかりだ。
Segata Sanshiro は君たちの心に真剣遊戯.
Things would stay on the downturn in 1998. Sony began to pull away as more and more software began to hit the PlayStation, much of it which never made its way onto the Saturn. In the West, 1998 would be the last year the Saturn would see new releases, and its market collapsed completely. The Saturn remained strong enough in Japan to see quite a few more releases throughout 1998 and into 1999, including some fantastic games from Capcom, the glorious Grandia, and of course Panzer Dragoon Saga. But the damage of an impending replacement prompted third-party support to drop off heavily. With the Dreamcast launching in Japan in November of 1998, those third parties moved on and the Saturn was left behind. Companies that already had Saturn games in development finished up existing projects to close out the platform. Saturn games slowed to a trickle as 1999 wore on, and the Japanese market disappeared beneath Sega's new interest. Only 3 games would see release in 2000 for the Japanese Saturn, the final games for the platform. While we're on the subject, it's important that we meet the truth head on. There is this overwhelmingly misguided myth that the Saturn was loaded with an absolute wealth of 2D content that the PlayStation couldn't do or do as well. I believe personally that it comes from the dominance the Saturn exhibited with its RAM cart titles. Stuff like X-Men vs. Street Fighter just wiped the floor with the PlayStation version. But the truth is that the PlayStation had a huge library of 2D games in Japan that often ran and looked just as good as their Saturn counterparts. You know that massive helping of shoot-'em-ups you see on the Saturn? Most of them were released on the PlayStation as well. Those Capcom Generation discs came out on the PlayStation, and believe it or not, so did most of their 2D fighting games. The list keeps going. Beat-em-ups, platformers, and even the oddball stuff often had PlayStation versions that held their own a lot of times. Of course, the pendulum of which was the better version swung back and forth quite a bit, but the PlayStation was quite a powerful 2D machine itself. Its only real deficiencies came in that it had less video RAM than the Saturn, both in the base system and in terms of RAM expansion capabilities, and it lacked the fancy VDP2 effects the Saturn was capable of. This tipped the scales mainly when it came to fighting games, but even then, later PlayStation releases, like Street Fighter Alpha 3, managed to be incredibly good on Sony's supposedly weak 2D machine. The simple truth was, they both did 2D games infinitely better than the machines before them, and they both had the power to do them extremely well. And perhaps more importantly, the PlayStation received most of the 2D games that appeared on the Saturn, and then some. So what's our takeaway here? The short version is that while the Saturn did sell well in Japan in 1995 and 1996, Sony took that lead away from Sega and never looked back, starting in 1997. By 1998, the Saturn began to lose third-party support even in Japan, and once the Dreamcast launched late that year, the Saturn began a spiral that would see it fizzle out by the latter half of 1999. The Saturn did see a lot more software released in Japan, and much of it couldn't be played anywhere else. There's no question that the Saturn had a better market there, but this notion that it was somehow a bastion of success is simply not true. While Virtua Fighter 2 sold nearly 2 million units, most Saturn software didn't even come close to those numbers, and there are numerous Japanese PlayStation games that sold much more. A deep dive into the best-selling Saturn games of all time reveals some pretty tame numbers even when looking at them worldwide. What that really means is that while Sega moved decent hardware units in Japan and Virtua Fighter 2 was a monster, most other software did numbers well below the big hitters that landed on Sony's machine. Japanese third-party PlayStation titles like Final Fantasy VII, Gran Turismo, and Dragon Quest outsold the best Saturn performers by millions of units. It wasn't even close. Once Final Fantasy VII launched in early 1997, Sony took Japan, never let go, and went on to absolutely smash the Saturn in terms of overall hardware and software sales there. The reason I made this video and what I want to leave you with is the idea that the Saturn can still stand on its own two legs based on the quality of its software library alone. We do not need to romanticize this notion that the Saturn performed so well in Japan that it somehow legitimizes your love and respect for it. I've never understood why sales has such a huge influence on the argument of a video game console's worth. I mean, if you take a look at any other artistic format, whether it be movies or music or whatever, the product accepted by the masses is often considered the inferior a lot of times. Yet when a video game or system doesn't sell well, it's immediately considered not just a business failure, but an artistic one as well. I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone use video game sales numbers as a reason their choice was best, or someone else's choice was total shit. I have and always will subscribe to the belief that sales mean absolutely nothing when it comes to the worth of something like a video game. I have seen games I have despised sell millions of units, and I have seen games I have loved crash and burn, selling next to nothing. You can punctuate your love of the Saturn with the fact that it sold better in Japan, but no amount of spin will ever change that Sony still crushed it there after only 2 years. And honestly, none of that matters the least when talking about which one you prefer. On the plus side, one could argue with the Saturn's installed base of just under 10 million units sold officially through 1998, it had a much higher attach rate for many of its best-selling games. I'm not saying that Saturn owners appreciated a better quality of game, but I will say this. Of the 100 million plus PlayStation owners in the world, many of them were happy with shit like Ford Racing and Dukes of Hazzard, never having touched games like Metal Gear Solid or Silent Hill. I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.